Welcome to the Plain Truth Discussion, where no conspiratorial rock will be left unturned, no mainstream propaganda will go unchallenged, and all existing reality boxes will be shattered. Piloting the discussion, as always, is the jet-setting international man of mystery, codenamed Plain. Co-piloting the storm clouds are Time Out Veterans Herm, myself, and of course the tea-drinking rabbit, Oolong. Tonight's special guest, along with Plain, is Raw Truth. Tonight's frequency is being broadcast across the secure Time Monk radio channels, so sit back, buckle your seatbelts, and ensure all overhead bins are secured, because we're definitely in for a very turbulent ride. Tonight's topic is life extension, waiting for Kissinger's wake. Opening the discussion is Plain.
Well, thanks, Herm. I guess I'd start with a question. Have you or Raw Truth noticed that a lot of, I guess what you would say, old elitists haven't really been dying very much the last 20 years?
Yeah. I have noticed Mr. Cheney's really hanging in there and is really pioneering the bioenergetics and more obvious, mechanical devices, definitely.
Well, how old is David Rockefeller now? Must be getting close to 100.
Yeah, he's about 100. And then his elementals, okay, just kidding. And then his employees like Kissinger or Brzezinski are what, 90 or something? I mean, yeah. This is getting to be kind of ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, I've been waiting and waiting for that party, that wake, Finnegan's wake, for those of us who, yep.
I was going to say all swords cut both sides, because we were talking about technology a few shows ago, and this is one of the side effects, right? Unintended consequences, perhaps?
Yes, but I'm being ever the optimist here, and I'm going to say that there's good news in these guys living so long, and that is you see it in various gangster organizations that nobody can challenge the people at the top. Right? They just are deferential and do what they're told and so on. And so they kind of are going to have a tough time getting fresh blood in and new ideas as long as, David Rockefeller is hanging around. And I mean, they're making efforts. The latest, was it this last Bilderberger? The one before that, they kind of tried to bring out the new generation a bit. But still, I mean, it's pretty sad if you got to, essentially have a guy who's 100 years old require all these meetings and everything like that. I mean, by all rights, you need that energetic, demonic thrust that comes from, 50-year-olds or something. But anyway, not just David Rockefeller and his employees, but other folks seem to be hanging in there a long time. And I mean, just as an example, in the United States today, it seems like at least a third of the people end up getting cancer. Right? I mean, it's everywhere. But think about top politicians in the last, let's say, 20 years. How many can you think of who've died of cancer? And by top politician, I don't mean like the governor of Mississippi. I mean like a key senator or a president. Somehow it seems statistically like it's less than it ought to be. And I'm going to argue that technology has been moving on, but we just haven't been told about it much. Raw Truth, have you got anything to say on that? Have you thought about how it looks like they just keep going on and on?
Well, I don't know about the cancer, because you had Ted Kennedy there. He had a brain tumor. And Arlen Specter had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
That's true.
So I don't know about that, entirely. Of course, Bill Clinton had his famous heart attack, but they're not entirely immune, but it looks like some of them certainly are onto some things that are not available to the rest of us.
Right. That's just my general take. I mean, we can also ask ourselves to what extent somebody like Ted Kennedy is going to have access. I mean, I somehow wouldn't view the Kennedy family as being friends with the Rockefellers.
Right.
Right.
Good point.
I'm not, I mean, I'm just saying it's a little hard to know, because we don't even know who would have access to what. But so it's just something to keep in mind. And the reason I bring that up is if we look back a bit, it wasn't that long ago when a real topic in the U.S. was life extension. Now, maybe it started in the modern sense with Timothy Leary, possibly, because he talked about that. Herm, you've mentioned this a couple of times, right?
Yes.
You like his motto. Do you want to explain that?
Oh, his SMI squared LE.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
that came. I guess he was around my age, or maybe a little bit older at the time. And he thought that one solution to the existential problems of humans on the Earth was to really push for a program for space migration. And he wasn't so much interested in length of life, although he addressed that a bit, but he was much more concerned with keeping the marbles going for a normal, during a normal lifespan. So hence the intelligence increase. And the life extension sounds like, life extension 220 years, but it was basically quality of life extension, so that some of the stuff that can get mitigated just to increase the value is probably much better than other compromises you might make that would give you a longer life. And anyway, his basic motto being, SMI squared LE at that.
Yes.
So I don't know if
space. No, that's a fair thing.
Yeah, space migration, intelligence increase, and life extension.
Right, and those clearly are big ideas, and really we need to think about them. And it's a shame we don't have discussions, I guess you'd say, by the Congress or whatever about that more. It seems like they want to keep these things basically hidden. But anyway,
I would agree with that, especially on the space program related stuff. Anyway, it went away.
No,
it just disappeared.
Just don't buy any of those night vision goggles. That's all.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, so that's kind of, I think, the modern context where it started. And before I move on, I got a personal story. A friend of mine was driving. I don't know, when the late 60s, let's say, and he pulled into a gas stand, and it was a little cramped there, maneuvering, and he's walking around the car, and essentially he bumped into Timothy Leary. They both were kind of surprised. They weren't expecting it. They were focused on, getting gas in the car, and my friend was, right in his face, and this is what my friend tells me. Of course, I wasn't there, but he just says, "My Lord, his eyes didn't look normal. He didn't look human. He didn't feel human." And my friend tells me this lasted for 5 seconds or something, and then it was back to the normal avuncular guy you saw on TV. And I thought that was kind of interesting. It doesn't prove anything. I'm not here arguing about trans-dimensional reptiles or something like that. I'm just saying it is an interesting thing. My friend really just felt like a bad vibe came off of him. Let's just put it that way. But
your friend is very perceptive, because I think I think Dr. Leary was an extremely complex character, and I think part of that is the fact that I think he expressed a lot of very, very extreme antisocial tendencies, and that was just who he was, along with all the other stuff. So I could see why your friend would sense something, something was awry. That's sort of the animal gut sense, maybe pheromonal kind of signal saying, "Get out of here before you get eaten." But anyway.
Something like that. Yeah, anyway, just an aside. But now I guess we can move on to the more modern period, perhaps, which I would say started in the late 70s. On the TV show Merv Griffin, they had a guy named Dirk Pearson come on a number of times, and I guess he was like their most popular guest. And have either of you heard of Dirk Pearson?
Yeah, and Sandy Shaw
Sandy
was
Shaw,
his partner. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And they came out with a book in 1982 called Life Extension. And that really put everything over the top. I think it sold millions of copies. And it was a big media thing, at least in the United States. Again, it was a bestseller. They were all over the place on TV. And there were a number of reasons for that. Pearson is a bit of an eclectic character, right? And so you could, the PR people could position him a certain way and make it interesting. And just the whole topic, I think, grabbed everyone's attention at the time. Anyway, though, it was a big, big thing. And around that period of time, a lot of other stuff happened. And I remember, because I was quite interested at the time, and you had things like the founding of the Life Extension Foundation. And really, it was quite an exciting time. And it went from interesting event to interesting event, and there were a lot of characters back then that were, I guess you'd say, worth paying attention to. And but anyway, they Pearson and Shaw really put it in the public mind, I think, is what I would say. And their book had all kinds of ideas. Now, for me, it was what can I say? It very, very technical in the sense they liked technical solutions. You know, there's some chemical that you ought to take, right? Because in rats, you live longer. And I guess what I'm trying to say is they were not what you might call on the holistic side. They were on the technical side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not really so much against that. I think you need a balance and you need to look at both. But I'm just trying to explain to people that this is where they were coming from. So, for example, they would argue that taking preservatives might be a good idea. Because if you give some preservative to mice, they live a little bit longer. And you know, that's questionable to those of us with a more natural perspective on things. But anyway, it was a big, big deal. And things exploded, like the Life Extension Foundation and small nutritional companies. Basically, it was an amazing time to watch. The industry just grew by leaps and bounds. And I don't know, do you remember that, Raw Truth? Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. I didn't really pay a lot of attention because I didn't have any really way to explore what they were pushing. I think they were selling a lot of supplements. Is that what it was?
Well, they really couldn't, because if they did, it would have been more or less considered to be illegal by the U.S. government. But they created brands of things, and then their buddies at other companies would sell them. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. But yeah, certainly, as I said, it was a very technical kind of approach, right? That, you know, mice live longer with A, B, and C, so we ought to take A, B, and C, right?
Yeah, right.
And that's not always bad, but I just think it should just be a starting point. It shouldn't be that in and of itself is enough. Herm, do you remember this period?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes, because that was a period where about, I don't know, maybe 70 or 80% of the stuff that was coming on, or you know, being consumer pushed or whatever, was, I think, pretty much from the get-go worthless or worse than that, other than the hit to the person's wallet, right? So I think I mean, I don't know, it seems that aspect seems to have actually gotten somewhat better than it was in those days. Although there's other negative consequences to more regulation, that's for sure. But
well, I don't know if it was that bad. There was a lot of hucksterism for sure. There was a great deal of hucksterism because when it became this big popular thing, no matter what the topic is, there are just endless people who say this is a way to make money, and they jump into it. And I also think that, to be honest, because I was paying attention at the time, I was quite interested in the topic. I think that there was I guess what I would say is too much optimism.
Yeah, that's a diplomatic and great way of putting it, I would say. Yeah, optimism.
Well, by too much,
Yeah.
though, I really mean that. I mean that people would say, we did 3 studies with mice and 2 of them were positive. That means it's good, right? We should find a way to sell it or something. And it's like, well, that's questionable. You know what I mean? If you only get 2 out of 3, then I think you need to do it a few more times. I don't really think that that's something I want to be swallowing. But right? But I remember it. But in addition to Pearson and Shaw, and oh, by the way, speaking of these, before this show, I thought I would look on Wikipedia and see what they had to say about a few people. And I joke that Wikipedia is CIA-pedia. And it really is pathetic how, what is the way to put this, dumbed down the descriptions are for a lot of people, right? They're just missing things that are quite important to understand the characters. And because, again, I from that time, I mean, I can remember I met or I knew some of these people. And for example, I won't name any names, but there was a guy who was well known going to a top technical school, university. And when he was there, that school's famous that all the books have to be written by the professors there. And the textbooks are incredibly expensive. And he, being a good capitalist, saw this as an opportunity. And so he and a few others had the textbooks printed in Taiwan, I believe it was, as I recall. And then they sold them for, half price or whatever. And that school is famous for its liberal approach. I mean, if you get convicted of manslaughter, they won't expel you or whatever, right? And but they did for him. They did for him because that was a serious crime. Manslaughter, they can forgive you, but printing textbooks in Taiwan, they don't want to forgive you for. But anyway, not naming any names, just mentioning that famous technical school in the Northeast that we all know and love. And this isn't mentioned in the Wikipedia explanation. So I'm just trying to say that when you look at the famous characters from that day, Dr. Wolford, and I could name a whole bunch of people, Ward Dean, and some of these people were more in Smart Drugs. Some of these people are very, very colorful characters, if you got to know them. And it doesn't come across in Wikipedia, in my opinion. But anyway, so moving on. So we had the Pearson and Shaw phenomenon, and it led to hundreds of supplement companies being created. It really created a big deal. And on the positive side, in addition to just that, I guess you'd say energy, you also had more, I think you would say, respectable attention put, like at UCLA. Dr. Wolford was doing studies with caloric restriction. Herm, do you remember that?
Yes. Yeah, and it's actually amazing that it's taken, well, it's amazing that to take advantage of that research now, one has to actually leave the country. If you want to go to, if you have a solid mass tumor that you could treat with dichloroacetic acid, you have to leave the country and go to Toronto because it's not done here. And that whole DCA research came out of his initial work with caloric restriction. So,
yeah,
but
so
anyway,
that's disappointing. But
yes, indeed.
But he was a colorful character. For example, he was involved in that, living in a like a tent essentially with other people.
Yes,
to
yeah.
emulate living on Mars, right, or living, in space somewhere, right? And that was an interesting thing too, in and of itself. But the idea of caloric restriction is amazing because it works so well in almost every animal, including, small ones. Herm, you might be more familiar, but I think it even works with spiders. I mean, it's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the ultimate irony, because caloric restriction is just about the hardest thing to do.
Well, I know. I think you're right. I actually, in terms of the, where technical meets spiritual, is exactly right there. Is the ability to learn how to control one's impulses regarding caloric intake. I mean, that's a spiritual solution, not a tech, but it's also a technical solution at the same time. So
No, I think you phrased that well. I think in a sense, it's kind of where the rubber meets the road.
indeed.
It's where your intent, your heart, your spirit end up meeting your physical body or something like that. And it's really quite interesting. And I admit that this is the toughest one for me. It's a lot easier to buy a pill, right?
Oh.
than it is to push away from the table. It's also hard because they put additives and oils and things that make it really difficult, right? I mean, you think that
not to mention actually the actual diet that is, that food pyramid thing, which is for probably half of the population in the U.S. has the genetics for it to be, basically an admission ticket to type 2 diabetes, right? I mean, Mexico surpassed the U.S. as, quote, the most obese, place on earth. And, there's a lot of Native American survival genes interacting with food 24/7, all the time, whereas it used to be half as available in the old days. Mm-hmm. So that's a sort of an extreme example, but anyway, yeah, it's the whole life. I mean, really, I think, growing up in this country, or it's in Europe. In Europe, it's a little less stringent because the agri companies haven't completely taken over yet, based on taste, and people they just can't taste like olive oil, so they're not going to get, the soybean oil market's not going to go there. But in the U.S., I think a kid growing up who's exposed to basically has a pretty good chance, depending on where they grow up, to be exposed to that fast food stuff and all that. That's the metric. So how are you gonna change that? Somebody's been doing it since they could. It's very difficult. Very difficult.
Well, in some sense, it's a spiritual thing. I mean, we need an awakening. But
yes.
But
yes.
Raw truth. I know, based on your name, that you're kind of interested in raw foods. Do you think that for raw foods, a lot of people end up essentially restricting their calories because they are satiated so quickly?
Yeah, that's part of it. I think when you eat raw, you're getting a lot of fiber along with the food, so you fill up quicker. Mm-hmm. When you're eating cooked foods, it's processed, it's compressed, it's concentrated. And you're consuming a lot more calories per time period before you start getting this sensation of getting full. Mm-hmm. But going back to the notion about restricting calories, I have a little different slant on that. I think the big focus we should be doing here is restricting refined carbohydrates. Because the human body really has no requirement for carbohydrates whatsoever. You do not have to eat carbohydrates to live. If you eat the correct type and quality of protein and fat, you can have a wonderful life, and you can feel full and plenty of energy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's where we've gotten off. And Herm, you were talking about Mexico. Well, look what they eat down there, mainly corn and beans. So that's a ticket to obesity. If you put...
I totally agree with you on the carbs. I mean, I think, and I think that when, it's not just how many carbs one eats or how many calories one eats, but also how frequently one eats that I think determines in some way how one's body reacts. Because I think having a period of time of say no carbohydrates to let your insulin recover
Yeah.
is way better than having carbs every 3 hours. And I think that, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think for some people, like those Native Americans with their whole genetic system for food is geared to getting the food when it's available, turning it into fat as fast as possible, because then they might have to go for 4 to 6 months without any food, and they have to be able to turn carbs into fat. So
Well, yeah.
so,
Yeah, we do have that survival mechanism, but if you look back at the Native Americans, when they were living off the buffalo, basically, when the white people were moving west, they were just amazed at the physical capacity of the Indians. I mean, these guys, these young braves, they could run miles and miles all day long without stopping. And they were just incredible physical specimens. The endurance and the energy that they showed. The white people were just, they were flabbergasted. How did they do this? Well, living off of buffalo pretty much, and not corn, because they were nomadic people at that time. They followed the buffalo herds. I would submit that the buffalo provided them the probably the optimal human diet that you could even eat.
Yeah, certainly were for them.
Well, certainly I mean, I think, though, that looking around the world, you can see that the human body is amazing and that people all over have had great performances with very little in the way of food.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in America, there's this view that in World War II, the soldiers captured by the Japanese were abused terribly, and some of them were in certain situations. But the biggest abuse was that they only got a bowl of miso soup a day and one little thing of rice. But basically, that was what the Japanese soldiers got, right? You can even fight a war on a little bit of rice and a bowl of soup a day. Yeah. And I don't think that's true for American soldiers today.
Probably
right?
not.
But I don't think that it's not an issue with our genes. It's just we're not used to it. And so I think, we had on Time Monk Radio, we had a guy who's famous for traditional, a Greek American guy who's famous for traditional fighting arts. And he talked about spending a lot of time as a kid in the mountains in Greece. And I think it was his uncle who would do things that you and I would only dream of, even if we go to the gym every day. Carrying 5-gallon jars of olive oil 20 miles, because he preferred the taste of the place 20 miles away. Right? And he talks about, he went there when he was in his early 20s. And so he was in great fighting shape, lifting weights every day, calisthenics, everything, right? And they're out trying to go hunting, and they didn't find anything. But they're out in the mountains, and his uncle said, well, since we're up here, we might as well make it useful. Let's cut down some trees and carry them. Whatever. I don't know how thick they were, but, hard trees are very, very heavy.
Yeah.
And they cut down a couple, and his uncle is like, no problem. He can carry these things. And he couldn't carry it, 20 feet. In the end, he had to embarrass himself, and it's like his uncle gets to carry 2, and he carries all the, the saws and the swords and all, the guns, right? And you sit there and say, so a guy in America who spends 5 hours a day at the gym and has big muscles, right, and is trained in martial arts, can't keep up with some little wily guy in the mountains of Greece. The image, of a 5'4" guy who's 105 pounds or something. And Anyway, this guy we interviewed, I think his name was Kostas Danos. He talked about how the truth is, if you look at the records, the historical records, the performance of the military, let's say in ancient Greece or in the Roman Empire, would put our guys to shame today.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they would be Olympic performers. The point is the entire Roman army would be in the Olympics today.
Yeah.
They, with heavy gear, would, run 25 miles a day every day for 3 weeks or whatever. And so I think we got to keep in mind that we have all these calories, but we're certainly not performing well. And that's one of the issues with the caloric restriction, is we're probably just simply not. I mean, I think, raw truth, you're saying it's the carbohydrates. We're probably the simplest explanation is we're killing ourselves with carbohydrates. But there's probably a lot more to it than that. But I just want to point out that you could live endlessly on a small amount of brown rice and some soup with a few vegetables and seaweed in it or something. That might not be ideal, but I'm just pointing out that historically speaking, we can think of whole cultures that have done it. So anyway, moving on a little bit from that. So we had Dr. Wolford, who was quite famous and also quite a character. And it's a shame that some of his stuff is maybe not more, like you were saying, Herm, you got to go to Canada to do certain things nowadays.
Yeah, well, partly, yes, let's say his marketing plan wasn't great.
Yeah, well, that's another issue. Yeah, sure. But one thing I remember is when Ronald Reagan got cancer, and I heard from the grapevine that he had to get treatment in Germany. It was illegal at the time in the U.S. And then now recently they're talking about one of the main things he got a treatment was said to be carnivora and then some other things. And carnivora is that extract of the Venus flytrap. Herm, you're probably more familiar with this, but I certainly know over the years cases like there was a famous, shall we say, sports figure, basketball figure, who, is deathly ill, and then all of a sudden he's not, right? And through the grapevine you hear, well, that's because he was doing all these different interesting oxygen therapies, right? And I even remember seeing an interview where somebody point blank asked him, "Are you taking the drugs for this?" And he refused to answer, as he was marketing the drugs. Not naming any names here, but if you were in that world, the alternative medical world at that time, you certainly ran into a lot of these stories. But of course, you can't prove it, so you don't want to necessarily name names. But that's another issue I think that's important. Is some of these treatments might be a lot of different things at once. They might be using some kind of injections like vitamin C, orthomolecular approach. There are a lot of famous cases where people have been on death's door, and just giving them a vitamin C injection essentially restores them to life. So it's a long topic. But if we're going to talk about life extension, I think there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning. One is kind of the technical approach that I was saying that you see with Pearson and Shaw. And then there's a more natural and then even a more, I guess you would say, kind of mystical kind of approach. I think you can break these two up. And some people are much more familiar with one as opposed to the other, right? So what would be an example? Okay, as an example, there's a guy who's famous in, I guess you would say, I don't know how to say it, the alternative world, but the alternative to the alternative world. Let's just put it that way. A guy named Art Kuhnken. He created the LA Free Press. He did a lot of interesting things in his time. And he studied alchemy under Frater Albertus in Utah for a long time. And in the last few years, he's been pitching the idea that he may have found something that would lead to a very long life. And he says, his hair is turning black again, and and he's in his 70s, and his libido is a lot higher, and things like that. And what he has done is he's taken pitch blend, basically. Now, he's got his own way of doing things, but let's just oversimplify here. Taking pitch blend with the natural radiation and putting, let's say, a piece of fruit in there, let's say a pear, and then eating, let's say, after it's stayed in the box with pitch blend for, let's say, a few days or something, eating one of those a day for the sake of the argument. And he's saying that natural radiation and the way it, I guess you would say, kind of impacts food, or at least fruit, decays fruit, is, amazingly good for health, supposedly. Now, I personally haven't done it, but that's a more eclectic, esoteric kind of approach. And I'd just like to see studies on it, to be honest. Herm, had you heard of that?
No, I had not. I had not heard of it. I guess part of the problem also with the studies is that creating such a large energy field of intent around something by putting your food inside inside with pitch blend, that alone could cause that change. I don't know how you would distinguish that, between people. Some people who are maybe more gifted or more able to do that, or to materialize their intent. It may not do the quote 100%, but it may significantly contribute. And then others might be impervious, and nothing happens to them. I guess what I'm saying is there'd be a lot of noise in that particular study.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of case-to-case details here, exactly. Because you also have the fact, okay, now we have a lot of radiation in the air from Fukushima, right? So there's a possibility that, yes, I know there's natural radiation and non-natural radiation, but nonetheless, with all of these things, you wonder, somebody who's never been exposed to something might react in a different way than to somebody who's essentially overly exposed. So we would just need studies. But anyway, though, the point I wanted to make with this is there are a lot of interesting things out there, and they don't get much publicity. And they're certainly, let's say, not encouraged by the academic establishment or the medical establishment. So what that means is we don't have enough data, really. We don't have enough people doing these things. I mean, if you wanted to repeat this study, I think at just about every university you'd be laughed at.
Right.
Right? So it's not going to happen, is the point I wanted to make. So that's one kind of idea of a more esoteric approach. And I'm not saying it works. I haven't done it. I'm just saying that this guy's been doing it. He's a kind of well-known character in the alchemy world. And he's been arguing, and certainly his body, when you talk to him, and you say, oh, God, you're that old? You certainly look a lot younger and whatever. And now you could say maybe he's faking it by dyeing his hair and stuff like that. And I don't know. But it's interesting. And then there are some other kind of more esoteric things, like the whole, as an example, Wilhelm Reich with his orgone and bions and stuff like that. Raw Truth, had you heard of Wilhelm Reich?
Yeah, sure have. And I think he had a lot of interesting insights, which the powers that be were very afraid of, which is why he died, I think, penniless in a prison or something like that.
Yes, he's another one of those very interesting characters, and reading it on CIApedia is probably not going to remotely do justice.
Right.
He, by the way, he died just as he was about to get out of prison, and some of us think. A lot of his notes have now been released just recently, last couple of years, that he was angry and he was going to release the information on his orgone engine. He had a car that ran on the orgone, which is essentially the life field around Earth or living things. And of course, in those days, I mean, he was just doing it experimentally in like forests and stuff where you got a tremendous amount of life force. Actually, in a big city like Los Angeles, there might be zero life force. So I'm not sure the engine would work in that situation. But that's another case of, was somebody killed because he had an engine that was not part of the petrochemical complex. But just talking about, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't know if you've heard of a fellow named Trevor James Constable.
He's a great guy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he used some of Reich's ideas to build these orgone accumulators, and he would attach them to the wings of a plane, and he became quite successful at making rain using those things.
Sure. What he's really famous for, though, and I've got videos and books of his where he worked as he worked on ships. He would go between the west coast of the U.S. and Hawaii a lot. He's originally from New Zealand. He worked in Australia, and anyway, he spent a lot of time on the ocean, is what I'm trying to say. It was his job, basically, and they would let him modify and test things because it didn't really affect them. And you can see his videos and his books where he would, out of a totally clear blue sky, create thunderstorms. Or he would break up thunderstorms with very, very simple and cheap equipment. And it's not really related to life extension, but I've done various tests of these different things in certain situations and been at places where it was necessary to put out huge fires and stuff, so you needed to bring in or create big storms. And I've seen that done. And this is another reason why weather reports have a lot of problems, is that two guys with some simple, cheap equipment can create massive thunderstorms. But anyway, we're not supposed to know that, I guess. But in addition to Constable, who's a great guy, and I recommend his books very highly. The Cosmic Pulse of Life is one of his interesting books. And I think if you read that, you will agree with him at the end that there is something called the Cosmic Pulse of Life. And the scientific approach to this is really fundamentally wrong. But going from that, there's a guy today named James DeMeo, who's perhaps the leading researcher of Wilhelm Reich's stuff in Southern Oregon. And he's got a PhD in weather modification, which when he got it, 20 or 30 years ago, there weren't very many people getting those things. Anyway, I've seen him at his place, at his lab, research facilities. You can do amazing things that Wilhelm Reich did. You can basically create life out of dirt, for one thing. There are levels below what we're familiar with. But as far as today's topic of life extension, the main thing is that this mysterious life force that Reich called orgone actually heals tremendously and makes you feel so much better if you can accumulate it. And he had an accumulator that does that. The problem, though, for most people is it really doesn't work nearly so well if you're in a polluted environment. And by polluted, I mean like electrosmog environment, right? So if you're in a big city like New York, really there isn't enough orgone to accumulate. To heal yourself, you need to leave New York, in my opinion. But anyway, so Wilhelm Reich is another one of these esoteric kind of guys. And when you look into it, I think you see amazing things. He started out, by the way, as a kind of a psychotherapist. He was Sigmund Freud's protege, but he broke with Freud. And his life is also interesting, and CIApedia, is so useless that you read it, and he was an enemy of the Nazis, and so he joined a communist cell. And then, anyway, he got out of the country on the last boat. He got out of Norway on the last boat coming to the U.S., and he broke with the commies very quickly and said they're just as bad as the Nazis. And when he was put in prison, interestingly, he said to everybody, "It's the commies who did this to me." And everyone laughed at him and said, "Oh, you're becoming paranoid. What have they got to do with anything? This is America. It's a free country." Right? Well, recently, somebody did a a book on him, on his life, and did a whole bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests. And they're all the FBI files, the FDA files. It was a number of these communists who came to the U.S., and then they've changed their names at different times, like they become neocons, the neoconservatives. They really, really wanted to get him because he broke with them. He knew a lot of their secrets, and he wouldn't keep his mouth shut about them. And anyway, that gets into more boring politics, but I'm just saying an interesting character. And I think he really ended up in prison half because of his politics and only half because of medical stuff. Anyway, for those out there listening, looking into stuff is very, very interesting. Herb, were you familiar with Wilhelm Reich?
Yes. I was familiar when I first came across reading about one of the massive book burnings that occurred in the U.S. And apparently his laboratory notebooks were completely burned. I mean, I was interested that you said that some stuff survived and it was published, because my impression was that I guess they got him for mail fraud, since he was selling the orgone generator, I guess, by mail or something, and they just seized everything and burned it. I was flabbergasted. So, but the other thing is, I think one of his most important books is not one that's oft discussed. And it has something to do with authoritarianism / fascism / communism, general, that kind of government construct is called The Function of the Orgasm, and I think that was part of one might say political / moral something. That also got him into trouble. But that is one powerful book. I mean, you realize how the how sexual politics is used for propaganda purposes and for commercialization. I mean, it was an incredible expose for its time. So,
yeah, he wrote several books that went, Observing Fascism, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, and Wake Up Little Man. Excuse me. He had different books that he was essentially arguing that there was a psychological problem that led to people wanting fascism. And in his later days, he was very concerned that was occurring in the U.S. But again, that's on the political side. But a lot of his stuff did survive. A lot of stuff he had was in different places. And in his will, essentially, he mandated that it be released X number of years after his death. And that occurred a few years ago. And so the institute or whatever that keeps his stuff in Maine, I think basically made it so researchers could look at it starting a couple years ago. So over time, there will be, books and things published that I think will probably be quite interesting. But anyway, on the health front, though, I can personally say from experience, different injuries and things, that an orgone box, an orgone blanket, some of these things help quite a lot. And I recommend them. But I do think there's the problem that they're essentially accumulating energy. But what if you're in a place with bad energy? Right? Right? If you've got an electric blanket on, right, you got a problem. Right? That's bad energy. You don't want an electric blanket. And so putting an orgone blanket over that is not going to help. It might make it worse. So that's kind of more on the esoteric side of things, right? But there are a lot of people like this that have interesting things that we can contemplate. And some of them may lead to a longer lifespan and some may not. But I think we can also think about other dietary approaches, right? So, Raw Truth, you've been doing the kind of raw diet for a long time now?
Yeah, I've been 100% raw for about 11 years.
Any general observations?
Well, I should... Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's an open topic, right? But I mean, let's say, do you feel like you have more endurance, or do you feel like, your eyesight is maybe slightly better? Things like that.
Yeah, definitely more energy and a much smoother digestion. That's a big benefit. But I should make it clear that my raw diet is quite different than what's usually considered a raw diet, which is the raw vegan diet.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really, the core of my diet is raw animal food.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, raw meat, raw fat. Because I learned a long time ago that my metabolism could not be supported in an optimal way with strictly vegetarian foods. What really got me into the diet experimentation was a book called Fit for Life back in 1988. And it was quite an eye-opener, but it was talking about mainly how bad processed foods are, and that was certainly true, but the book recommended primarily a fructivore diet, which, is fruit, heavy in fruit. And I got all kinds of energy when I started on this diet, but it had a downside, which about 9 months later, I was starting to experience an extreme lack of sex drive. And I wasn't total vegetarian at that time, still was eating a little meat, but just that heavy input of fruit, it just flipped me over into a state that I was energetic mentally, but getting out and doing physical work I became more resistant to doing that, and the energy started to become sort of an anxiety rather than good endurance type energy. So, these experiments I've done, they taught me I just cannot live without some animal protein. In fact, I need probably more than, the general population, I would say. And also high quantities of fat.
How does your thinking differ from some of the thinking about traditional diets? What is that foundation that promotes traditional?
Talking about Weston A. Price?
Yeah, the Price, Weston Price.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty much in agreement with them. The traditional diets are much superior to our current modern diet. But I think a focus more on indigenous people's diets would be more in order, because the Price people still have a heavy reliance on what I would call Neolithic foods, which, when people settled down and started agriculture and keeping livestock, and they began relying on grain and dairy foods. And I think these two categories of foods created a lot of health problems for a lot of people. Now, over the years, some people, I would admit, have probably adapted somewhat to eating some varieties of these foods, although I think modern wheat and the typical pasteurized, homogenized, sterilized milk that we get in the grocery store is not, beneficial for anyone. But where was I going with this? What was your question again?
Well, I asked about the Weston Price Foundation.
Oh, yeah.
And so, how you kind of differ, or what your experience has shown versus, let's say, what they're recommending.
So, they emphasize, okay, you can still eat grain, you just have to ferment it, or you have to soak it for long periods and change the water and da-da-da-da-da. And dairy is fine as long as it's raw dairy from grass-fed cattle. I'm not, I've tried eating and drinking that kind of dairy, and it just doesn't work for me. Dairy contains a lot of opioids, and it also is highly mucus forming. For example, the protein in dairy products is called casein, and that is used in making glue. and it will, it will stick your body together, your cells together, and make it difficult for the lymph system to operate. The lymph system is very important in human metabolism for removing toxins. And of course, in the modern world, we're getting toxins every breath of air we take, and a lot of the foods and a lot of the water too. So we need to keep that lymph system clean and clear and operating at peak efficiency, and dairy just clogs it up, in my opinion. So that's where I differ with the Western price people. I don't think these foods are necessarily optimal. I do agree some people can process dairy probably better than me, but for my own part, I stick to animal foods and a few green leafy vegetables and a few sour type fruits. And I do agree with Price Foundation on if you're going to eat nuts, which is not a substitute for meat because they are high in arginine and they're low in lysine. And I think Linus Pauling and his collaborator Rath, I think his name was, they did a lot of work to show that lysine is a critical nutrient for humans along with vitamin C. And so you can't go too heavy into the nuts, but if you do eat some nuts, the Price people talk about soaking them, and I think that's a very good way to, you get rid of a lot of the anti-nutrients because a nut has a lot of properties to protect it from decay until it gets the optimal conditions in order to sprout. So because of the nut's ability to not decay, there are certain things that keep the body from being able to break it down very well. And when you soak the nut for a proper period of time, it helps bring it into sprouting and reduce those anti-nutrients so the human body can handle it better. So I think the Price group is doing a lot of good work, but I'm not 100% in agreement with all the foods they promote.
So a question, when you did the more vegan approach, did you have soy?
No, I stayed away from soy pretty much because I found out early on that I have pretty allergic reactions to soy. And Price, the Price people are very down on soy, and I do agree with them on that.
Oh, no, I totally agree. I'm just saying that I think a lot of the health problems, well, there's so many, you don't know where to begin. But one of the health problems in the U.S. is the use of soy in extreme and in non-fermented ways.
Right. Fermented soy, is not nearly as bad, may even be healthy for some people. But,
right. But the whole discussion of diet is really like an endless one because there's so many variables. I mean, I might have mentioned it before, but I took a trip to the U.S. and I was in a hotel room and turned on the TV and they had an ad, and it was a black family talking about how they wanted to eat ice cream but couldn't. But if they went to a doctor and got a pill, then they'd be able to enjoy dairy. And I thought that it just shows how, in a sense, lost people are today.
Really?
That the idea that, you need to go to a doctor. I mean, the answer is if dairy doesn't agree with you, don't eat dairy.
Yeah.
And obviously, genetically speaking, it's considered mainstream science that those of African descent have a lot more trouble dealing with dairy products than, say, somebody from Ireland or something like that, right?
Right.
And that's just the way it goes. I mean, we have differences. And that's not even getting into the way the mass production of dairy is today and how that's got all kinds of problems. But my personal experience is that dairy products are really horrible for your lymph system, and that you get endless mucus, and that dairy is probably not such a great thing. I do think that raw milk and such, raw goat's milk and stuff, may be okay for a lot of people in certain circumstances. And I'm not trying to be an absolutist here. I'm just saying my personal experience is that I've seen a lot of people get over various problems when they give up dairy. They also have all kinds of hormones in it. So from personal experience, know people who liked dairy in another country, and then they moved to the U.S., and it always makes their stomach upset.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes that's even with the so-called natural stuff, the supposedly organic or whatever.
Right.
So I'm not quite sure what would affect, why the organic would be so bad as well. But it is just worth considering that somebody who's happy with dairy, in Ireland may come to the U.S. and then have a lot of problems. But anyway, so trying to get more towards the side of the life extension with it, though, I think diet is a really, really important aspect of this. It's just hard to categorically state, A or B. There was a period in my life when I did kind of a raw vegan approach for, I don't know, maybe a year. And at the end of that, I had essentially like the best blood that, you could make a textbook out of it. If you did something like dark field microscopy, it looked so good it was painful. Far better than I'd ever had before, in other approaches. Now, I'm not promoting this. I'm not saying, go do this. I'm just saying that this is my experience with raw diets. I haven't tried a more Paleolithic, meat diet. And when I tried that, I didn't have the problem that you had. But then again, I take a fair number of supplements, right? And so that can impact it. And I don't limit myself to, let's say, just the, how could we say it? Just the food. I mean, I will take like all kinds of green superfood supplements, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's a little bit more complicated.
Oh, yeah. And I think one thing I forgot to mention, I think there's a lot of different variations in human metabolism, and there's a concept known as metabolic typing. Are you familiar with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A little bit. I go forward. Say a little bit.
Yeah, there's actually I think it was brought into the mainstream by a dentist named William Donald Kelly, who had a lot of success treating cancer. And he actually healed himself from cancer by diet. And actually, I think he went pretty much towards the vegetarian type diet, cut way back on his red meat and all that, and just ate a little fish, a little poultry here and there, and mainly lots of vegetables. Mm-hmm. And he beat his cancer; it went away. And so a few years later, his wife came down with cancer, so he put her on the same diet that he'd been on. Well, it didn't work. She just got worse and worse. The cancer kept growing and growing, and he finally, eventually, he figured out, oh, she needs meat. This woman is not the same metabolism that I am. So he started giving her a more meat-focused diet. Of course, without the processed food, good natural meats, and she recovered, and her cancer went away. So from that early experience, he developed this whole system called metabolic typing, where he would classify people based on a questionnaire. It would have, I think, 200 or 300 questions, and then this would tell you, is your genetic inheritance more that of a meat eater, or is it leaning more towards a vegetable type diet? And what he found in the cancer world was that all of the hard tumor cancers, like breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, lung cancer, those type of cancers, typically people getting those cancers were the types of people that did better on the more vegetarian-leaning diet. Those who got lymphomas and blood-type cancers, leukemia, those kind of people did better if they focused more on a heavy protein or a protein fat, animal fat focused diet. So he was like the first one to come up with this metabolic typing idea and put it out there. And you can still get his book. He died a few years ago, but the book is still available on the internet.
Yes, well, that's something I think that's worth considering. Another thought with this, though, is that everybody's different. And it may be that, for example, the pH is very important, right? Some people, particularly with cancer. And so, one thing might work if you're in a certain state, and it might not work. It would work totally differently in a different state. I know.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but actually Kelly felt like depending on your metabolic type, the body would handle certain foods with a different pH result depending on how your metabolism processed the food. So you couldn't say categorically that, okay, meat is an acid food.
No, I don't mean, that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that, let's say your metabolic processing, somebody can handle 4 cups of coffee a day and somebody else can only handle 2 before they become too acidic or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so I guess what I'm just trying to say is, like everything with health, it just depends.
Oh yeah,
it's awfully complicated, is all I'm trying to say. And
sure.
In this discussion, let me give you an example. If you think about things from a different perspective, like in Ayurvedic medicine, one of the great crimes, so like one of the rules, is that you can't eat if you have anything left in your system. Essentially, in other words, you can't eat until you want to eat. Mm-hmm. Right. So if you eat breakfast at 10 and then you eat lunch at noon, that's essentially a horrible crime in Ayurvedic thinking, mm-hmm. because you haven't fully digested breakfast yet.
Sure.
And they, like many Asian philosophies, tend to see things as being kind of, there are cycles that are needed or required for everything, right? And that you're not finishing the cycle. 2 hours is not long enough. And so obviously then they would see the snacking idea, 5 light meals a day or something, might not work very well as they see it. I'm not sure. I can't speak for them, but I'm just trying to say they're different thinking. There are different types of thinking in different parts of the world. And, if we look at the historical context of where did people live a long time or whatever, let's take, for example, Japan. They've had, long lifespans, right? And their traditional food is kind of, was copied in the making of macrobiotic diets, right? And I happen to like my macrobiotic diets. I like the taste, I like the style, whatever. Although I think the traditional diet in Japan had, selectively had, more fish and whatever. It certainly wasn't, like some pure vegetarian thing. But that's worth considering too. But then again, maybe the reason it works well is the Japanese have a lot of sea vegetables. And maybe it's the trace minerals, the lack of trace minerals, that's causing so many health problems in certain areas. Oh, yeah. I'm not an expert in this. I'm just saying it's something that we all have to consider. That it's, maybe, for example, one of the reasons maybe meat sometimes is useful is because it sounds funny, but it might have more minerals in it. It might accumulate, things that are hard to get in the natural environment in the Great Plains, let's say.
Oh, yeah. Well, Buckminster Fuller, he was very much a pro-meat eater. He said, you should eat where the most energy is accumulated, and that would be in an animal that's been eating plants. Mm-hmm. When you eat the plants, you're not getting as high a degree of energy as if you eat the animal who has processed the plants.
Right. And again, so we get back to the idea that it's awfully tricky. But it's easy to say, though, that we should spend a lot of time personally looking at these people who've written books, whether it's on metabolic typing or whether it's on the development of different approaches to things like Weston Price or macrobiotic. And what we for sure need to do is get away from the processed stuff. Oh, okay, yeah. Fresh is best. and minimal processing is best. And all if it's got a chemical name to it, that's a really bad sign. You don't want it.
Right.
I mean, I can, I on airplanes I can't eat anything they offer at almost every airline. The
No,
food's totally unfit for human consumption, as far as I'm
I,
concerned.
I agree.
So you understand that. Okay, so that was a little bit about diet, and that's really important, but just an endless and complicated topic. Um, but I think we can move on a little bit to some of the overlap, I guess you would say. Some things, I'm not sure you can separate life extension from quality of life or, let's say, brain function, right? Because when I was interested in this a lot, I was also interested in smart drugs. Herm, you're familiar with smart drugs, right?
Yes. Yep.
And
Well, going back to what you said, pretty much if it's got a chemical name, I will, and I probably will have heard of it if it's been used in humans. How's that? I'll stick my neck out.
wow.
When it comes to psychotropic drugs.
When it comes to legal drugs.
Of course, totally legal.
Right, of course. I understand. Have you heard of Orasol? Do you know what that is?
Actually, no, I have not. Thank you, but
Okay.
no, go ahead.
Okay, well, Orasol is used for mental improvement, and it's essentially gold.
Oh, okay.
And gold, throughout the ages in different forms, has been used to either improve lifespan or intelligence or spiritual awareness. And you probably heard of the whole monoatomic gold phenomenon, and maybe that was the manna of ancient Egypt and so on and so forth. And I don't know, that's worth a show in and of itself, is monatomic gold. But gold, as far as a modern medicine or something, it has been used. It is known, and the brand name was called, or I think it was the brand name was called Orasol, and it would improve IQ for tests and whatever significantly. Let's say 10 points or something like that. Apparently, the electrical functioning in the brain or what have you. So you could look into that. I kind of doubt it had anything to do with life expectancy or anything. But when we get into smart drugs, then we get into, let's face it, if your brain is functioning well, that's going to help you immensely in getting your whole body functioning, right? And if your brain is lethargic, it's going to be difficult to essentially improve. So they kind of go together, I think. And I remember when smart drugs became a big topic. Raw Truth, do you remember that?
Not too much. No.
No? Okay.
No.
Herm, you remember it?
Yes. I mean, I think the Dirk and Shaw brigade there did quite a good job selling the nootropics at the time. Right?
Well, I think there was a book called Smart Drugs, and I think maybe Smart Drugs and Nutrients or something like that, by Ward Dean and Morgenthaler, I guess. And I remember that because there were so many threats against the authors, and Ward Dean had been a doctor for the Delta Force and things like that, and the military told him essentially, if you go on TV like Larry King or whatever it was, we're going to smash you. And he told him to stuff it, and he went on, and after that, essentially, he was an enemy of the state. So later, prison or other things, because that's what happens to good scientists, is they end up in prison. And he wrote a very good book called The Biological Measurement of Aging, I think. I have a copy of that lying around. So Ward Dean was quite an interesting character in this whole field back in the day. But anyway, moving to the smart drugs, there were the whole nootropics, how do you say it?
Nootropics. You have to sort of ride the nootropics. At
Yes.
least that's my...
Anyway,
So-
all these drugs from back then, and some of them were kind of much more standard, let's say in Europe. I mean, they might have used them in France or Germany or something like that. So they were maybe unknown in the U.S., but they weren't necessarily unknown in the rest of the world. And indeed, statistically speaking, they seem to offer a lot in terms of, mental performance or oxygen flow, things like that. As I recall, Hydergene did wonders if you were oxygen deprived in the brain. So, France or other countries would require it for certain kinds of accident victims or stroke victims or such. There was just a long list of these things that were quite useful. And my gut tells me if your brain is working better, the odds are it's going to help your body work better. So they probably go together. And anyway, as a practical matter, it's not long life we want. It's a long, productive life, right?
Right.
And the most frightening thought is to spend 10 years, in a bed or a table or something, and you can't, essentially recognize your own children or something.
Right. Who was it that asked the gods for eternal life, but forgot to ask for eternal youth?
Yes.
Very, very bad.
That was a bad mistake.
Yes.
Mistake. Right. So, now some of these we could name some of them. Hydrogen. I think Diprenol. Herm, you're familiar with Diprenol. Yes. You say you're familiar with all of these things, so maybe I should let you talk.
L-phenylalanine. You can go through the list as to how they're organized in terms of. You can give a prodrug that is then activated by your body into the putative active compound. So, for example, dopamine precursors, L-phenylalanine, L-tyrosine, L-dopa, things that help in the formation of that, like vitamin B6. Those are actually, before going on in terms of nootropics versus I guess the whole thing of cognitive enhancers. Some people mistake the two. Do you have a good definition for slicing the two of them? In other words, what differentiates a neurotropic from a cognitive enhancer? Because I noticed I started right off on the cognitive enhancers, which happens to be an interest of mine. But I guess some cognitive enhancers.
Well, I would consider a cognitive enhancement is to be a broader field. So to me, exercising or going in a hyperbaric chamber is a cognitive enhancer to me, right?
Okay.
So
Good point. Okay.
So I think of nootropics as being more of a certain field of pharmaceutical, to be honest. But this is not my field, right? I'm not some specialist.
Well, there's,
in this.
I guess there's some discussion about it in terms of, especially with newer technology that is quote prescription versus nootropics that tend to be non-prescription because they're generally recognized as safe. So maybe that's one good definition. One good definition is a nootropic is a chemical that either directly or indirectly acts as a cognitive enhancer and is generally recognized as safe.
Right.
Something like that, and you're right. There's other ways to cognitively enhance. So I guess.
We're skipping exercise, right? We're talking about don't eat too many carbohydrates.
You ask the pharmacologist, you get a pharmacological answer. Well, you can go through the other stuff too, but you're totally right, of course. If you want to take the non-technical, I guess you called it stuff, that would be good too. You want to go through that first, or
no? I think we would just go through a few of them. One of the ones that probably is relevant for life extension is Diprenol, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, do you want to talk about Diprenol a minute or two?
Sure. Actually, one of the reasons Diprenol's also known as selegiline,
right,
or L-Dipril, I guess is the other name. And what it is it is an MAO inhibitor, or at least let me put it this way: it's purported that its mode of action is by its very potent and irreversible inhibition of MAO, of your monoamine oxidase. So your brain has to has to make it again before it's active. And the other, I guess the other actions which have to do with life extension are completely different as far as we can tell from that first action as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. They act at much lower doses, and they appear to involve pathways that do all kinds of stuff like enhance nerve growth factor. So it was discovered in the mid-50s in Hungary, and has had probably, along with L-DOPA, it's been one of the better studied of the drugs, and has now currently is still used quite a bit for treatment of Parkinson's disease.
Right.
And in fact, that's probably one of its major uses. Another use, some people use it as an antidepressant because you can use higher doses without getting that very, very bad rise in blood pressure, and it's also used by probably a lot more people than are registered, whether by prescription or et cetera, for life extension purposes.
Right. Sure. So I remember it back in the day, and it wasn't as expensive back then. It seems like it's really become quite expensive in the last 10 years or so. But what I remember most is there was a guy named Jay Kimball in Florida who found a better, cleaner way of manufacturing it. I think his was called deprenyl citrate. And it was threatening to take the industry by storm because I think his manufacturing technique was possibly going to be used for various other drugs as well. And the power brokers, the people who controlled the drug industry, considered him a real threat. And they smashed him like a bug. I mean, they took him to court, and the maximum sentence for what he was charged with was 3 years, and they sentenced him to 13.
Yeah.
Which is the American way. Somebody comes up with a great, better, safer, fewer side effects. Because with deprenyl, there's a remote trace of methamphetamine, I think, right?
There can be if it's improperly manufactured, yes, and also it's actually metabolized partly to methamphetamine, but it's the wrong. Some molecules are sort of like the left and right hands. They sort of mirror images of each other,
and they're not active.
Yeah, it's not active, but in fact, people who are on it may come positive on the urine toxicology test for methamphetamine.
Right. And so I'm familiar with it. In Japan, it was illegal because of the manufacturing process. The government argued that it would have this trace amount of methamphetamine, and therefore methamphetamine in any level was a crime. So deprenyl was illegal in Japan based on that. But anyway, this other better way of manufacturing by Jay Kimball was a threat to the system, not just for deprenyl, but for other things. And so they smashed him like a bug. And last I knew, I think he was still in jail and probably died there. They'll probably keep him there forever. And that's, again, unfortunate. But the other thing, though, is I think they just don't want it out. I mean, it's become really quite expensive compared to what it used to be. And even if you order it from Europe or Asia or something like that, it's not so cheap anymore, and that makes me think it's probably good. because in addition to being a conspiracy theorist, I'm a contrarian. Well, I'm a stubborn, ornery, contrarian, and if they don't want me to have it, I want to know why, right? Like, to me, the best argument that hemp oil or something hemp might be good is just the fact that it's illegal, right? I mean, sorry, but I mean, I don't want it. I mean, I don't need to eat anymore. I don't need to get the munchies or something, right? But if there must be a reason it's illegal. These people are criminals. So anyway, so that's Duprenal, which I think showed a lot of promise. And then, Herm, you'd be up on the last, 10, 20 years of research a lot better than
I think people debate endlessly in Parkinson's. I won't deal with the Parkinson's part of it, although it's still used. So most people agree it's effective. But the on the other side of it, it's one of these things that Plain alluded to earlier in the program, where you have these incredible results in animals, and I'm not, for example, animals that live 50% to 100% of their normal lifetime, and can actually go around their maze pretty much like they could when they were young. Now you could say, yeah, well, I'm a little different from a rat, but when you can also take it to looking at the older rat brains, and that. Well, I was going to say for many people, human brains are quite different. Yes, but if you look at human brains, there are quite a lot of similarities in older brains between young and old humans and young and old rats. So. You can see that propelled quite a bit of self-experimentation in the field, because the findings have been. I mean, that's one of the strongest findings. The second thing was that nobody felt really a great need to do any further discovery of problems once the drug had been used, for 10 or 15 years. And I think that's in general. Drugs that have been out for a very, very long time have had, decades of experience. You get your really deathly side effects early, out in the first 5 years. And that's actually a good thing to remember if you're ever forced into a possibility of having to absolutely take some antibiotic or something, is take the one that's been out at least 5 years. So the experience with it in Parkinson's is you give it to very, old, debilitated, sometimes people, and it seems to be very, very safe. So I think as far as one of the agents that one has the most experience with, in terms of having a very, very good chance of producing effects in humans, is Duprenal. However, if you were to say, well, gee, have there been any studies, that have actually convinced you that it works in humans? I'd have to say no. I mean, officially done studies. So,
well, Herm, we never will achieve perfection. That's not
exactly.
Don't worry about that. So, Raw Truth, have you got any familiarity with supplements or some of these related things?
Well, yeah, I'm pretty ignorant about the drugs, but one supplement besides vitamin C has gotten my attention lately. That's vitamin K2. Are you familiar with that one?
Not sufficiently. So why don't you go on and?
Yeah. Well, Dr. Weston Price, we talked about him a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And he was basically a dentist who, in the early part of the 20th century, he went around the world studying indigenous cultures, native peoples eating their traditional diets. And, he looked at their teeth and because the first signs of health problems usually show up in the teeth, right? Mm-hmm. And so he, based a lot of his dietary ideas on what he found among these people. And, the main thing he found was if they continued eating their traditional diet, they stayed healthy. If they started eating processed foods, white flour, sugar, all the processed stuff, they would invariably start getting tooth decay and poor arches, among their children and those kind of things. And he found in particular that there was a component of animal fat when the animals were eating fast-growing green grass in the spring. And there was something in that fat that was very important for health. And he actually concentrated that substance into something he called butter oil. He would take butter made from milk of cows that were eating, the green grass in the spring, and then he would concentrate that oil, that butter, down to an oil. And he used this for a lot of his people that he had good luck healing, chronic diseases. And he speculated what was in this fat of these animals, and he didn't know what it was. It was something that science hadn't identified. He called it activator X. Well, in recent years, it's actually been found that his activator X is what we know now is vitamin K2. Now, vitamin K1, we've known about that for a long time. That's a component of green vegetable material, which is important to blood clotting. And, you have to have a certain amount of that so your blood will clot. But the K2 is an entirely different matter. The K2 actually is very important in vitamin D metabolism. There's a lot of attention on vitamin D these days, but vitamin D can't work unless there's enough K2 to enable it to work. In other words, vitamin D encourages the creation of proteins that build bone, but that particular protein called osteocalcin will not actually build bone unless it's activated by the presence of vitamin K2. And on the flip side of that, there's another protein called matrix GLA protein that vitamin D is involved with. And this is kind of it's what the function of this protein appears to be to sweep calcium out of the soft tissues. In other words, out of the vascular, your blood vessels, out of the organs, and to keep it from accumulating in those places, which is kind of important if you'd like not to have clogged arteries. Well, this matrix GLA protein, likewise, can't really function without vitamin K2. So it's turning out that this K2 is a really, really important nutrient that is practically not present in modern diets, because how many people are eating fat from grass-fed animals? Not many.
That's a good question. Probably not very many. Are you of the view that there are any supplements that basically provide this vitamin?
Oh, yeah. They found a way, actually, that, we were talking about fermented soy, and there's a fermented soy product called natto. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with that. Do you eat it?
Yes, I like it.
Do you really? Because not many people can stand it. It's really slimy and stinks really bad. And, a lot of people just can't stand the stuff, but it's supposed to be really, really good. It's very, very high in vitamin K2.
Well, in Japan, there are hundreds of different variants, and I have probably tried 50 of them, and I like them all.
Well, good for you.
But, and then, they sell natto kinase in the U.S. nowadays, right?
Yeah.
Well, then you get back to, I guess I'm diverting things slightly, but I'd like to say, okay, so here you've got some traditional food in Japan that's been around for ages that's really good for health, I think, at least in, small doses, right? We really need to think about, like Weston Price, the traditional stuff. We need to think what worked and what didn't. How come those, Indians in the Great Plains could run all day, right?
Yeah, right.
And how come, people in Okinawa, live so damn long, right?
Yeah.
We really need to look into those things because, sure, there may be some genetic issue, but it's really likely that diet is the single, the single most, like lifestyle and diet are going to be overwhelmingly the issues that we need to look at. And So anyway, yeah, that's interesting. That vitamin K2, that's something I'm going to have to spend more time. I'd only spent, my knowledge of it was more like the headline and the first paragraph kind of knowledge.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You know how it is, because we're overwhelmed with information these days. It's, they say it's the information age, but it's like really the headline and the first paragraph.
Right.
is the only thing we have time for, right?
A couple more anecdotes on K2. The Japanese actually have pioneered reversing osteoporosis using vitamin K2. Have you heard of that one?
That I hadn't heard of.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
they have good research actually. I'm quite familiar with Japan, and it gets a bit of a bad rap in the U.S. about how they like only copy and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. I mean, they do have a problem with budgets. Their universities don't have the big budgets that MIT or a place like that would have. And so if you need expensive equipment, they don't have sufficient expensive equipment. There's no question about that. But if it's something like, that doesn't require $1 million piece of machinery, they're not so bad on different things like medical research.
Yeah, and another thing with the K2, a lot of people who start taking this supplement, they see their tartar on their teeth starts to disappear. Most of the time you'll accumulate tartar on the inside surface of your bottom front teeth.
Right.
Yeah, and you start taking this K2, it goes away, and that's been the case with me. I only started a few months ago, but it's declining dramatically. From I used to build it up like every 3 weeks. I'd have to take this little metal scraper and scrape the stuff off because it started annoying me. But it's accumulating very, very slowly now that I've gotten on the K2. So that's another example. That's an example of how it enables the calcium to go where it's needed and not where it's not needed.
Well, I'm going to have to look into it. That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
So the point is there are all of these topics out there that we need to really kind of exchange information. I mean, not, of course, just us here at this show, but everybody. We kind of need to try to learn from everybody else, and everybody has something to add to the discussion.
Sure.
You just can't know it all. And the people who know it all, though, of course, are certain doctors, right? Just kidding. Not
medical
trying,
deities.
not picking on our medical deities. No, just kidding. Because I like plenty of doctors. I'm just saying that we just have to admit there's an overwhelming amount to try to learn. So I think that's one thing. Well, what can I say? I think that just about should wrap it up for this performance, this show. So, any last things you'd like to add, Herm?
Yes, and going back actually to the beginning of the show, I think the whole philosophy between why we would want life extension, and also exactly why we, in a way, it for example, it makes me question on the spiritual side. Well, gee, am I so attached to this that I can't just go through my life and let it happen, and then whatever happens, rather than worrying about, gee, am I taking my selegiline, and I better get my vitamin K2 here, and I better do this. I think maybe stepping back a little bit too, and seeing how all this technology, and essentially we're talking again about a certain type of technology and how it really affects us, other than all the sort of micro effects that one might have taking this stuff, or doing exercise, or doing kettlebells, or whatever. I think is something to think about. And maybe it even, suggests maybe some future, a future topic
Well,
for you.
Herm, well, I think we can have some future discussions because this really is so important. Um, One thing I'd say, because I was familiar with the what I guess you'll call the life extension community, the people behind things like the Life Extension Foundation or some of these researchers back in the day. One issue, and I kind of got into it a bit with Dirk Pearson, is there's kind of this technological fixation and mechanistic approach that I was a little bit guilty of in my younger days. And I think some people are still a little bit too guilty of it. For example, I went to the cryogenic facility that the some of the life extension people had put together in Riverside, and and then there was this whole famous dog, and I don't know what you want to say, but Saul Kent's mother, when they cut her head off and put her in the cryogenic. Do you remember that?
The media circus.
There was a media circus about this.
Gosh,
like, was she dead when they cut the head off, right? Or was she like an hour before death or an hour after death?
Is the soul in the brain or is the soul in the heart? Really important questions. Yeah.
Anyway, so that whole thing, it's just there's been this mechanistic approach that I don't know how to say it, but it's kind of like I just don't want to die. Right, that's it. You know what I mean? Death is such a tragedy and so on. And I guess I can relate to that. I do understand. I felt that a bit at times. But I think on the other hand, you can't let that overwhelm the bigger picture is to enjoy a good, productive life as long as you can. And, the idea that maybe hundreds of years from now they'll bring you back in some robotic form, that really is a mechanistic approach to things, and I think I'm just more of a fan of the holistic side. But it is definitely a spiritual thing. I mean, there's no question. There's a side to it. Like, what are you thinking? Why are you thinking that? And some of these guys, like Raw Truth, you're talking about K2. I'm sure that some of the more mechanistic guys are just thinking about how, I don't know what to say, but they want to give it to a mouse, and then they want to say, okay, what's the dose so that I can take it? And then there's a 5% reduction in cardiovascular disease, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the only thing they're looking at. But I think we need to kind of think the bigger picture is if there's something this important that we haven't had in our diets, right? Is there a way of getting it in our diets? Because you know what I mean. I think they're kind of there's been this push for medicine, for pharmaceuticals, and for supplements, and there's a business push for them. But for us as individuals, it should be more the health push. And so I'm just saying we all need to step back a bit.
Yeah.
And okay, Raw Truth. Any final thoughts you'd like to add to it?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about food and life extension, but I think we could probably do another whole show on your emotional and your spiritual attitude toward life and how that affects your health as well as the length of your life. And that's just a really important topic, I think, that may even override the importance of food. Even though I'm pretty focused on food, I'm coming to appreciate those other aspects, every year I live longer,
Well, I can tell you, Raw Truth, here's my secret for long life, okay? We didn't go into this because this is a deep, deep, dark secret. But if you want to kill somebody, it's easy. Play heavy metal. And if you want to live a long time, play Mozart or something Bach. Right?
Yeah, I go for that, yeah.
Okay, I'm not trying to pick on the fans of heavy metal who like it as a stimulant, essentially, because, I drink coffee. I mean, it's not that some stimulation is a bad thing. But I'm just saying we do have, and we might do a show in the future on this, we do have evidence that essentially plants will die young and be unhealthy if you put them in a violent kind of sound environment.
Oh, yeah.
And if you give them classical music or classical Indian music, they'll live a long time. And then we also see see food production, the famous sonic bloom, if you're familiar with that.
Yes.
The whole, right?
Yeah.
If you just give plants a few things, like the sound of birds in the morning, classical music or classical Indian music, and preferably a little bit of misty water spray, they will grow tremendously better.
Or
And
even
I think
talk to your plants.
Yeah, and of course, talking to your plants comes with it. And so it's entirely possible that in addition to sound, you could even just have bad artwork or something, or photos of people dying at car accidents and put that next to your plant, and the plant might be unhappy. And so Raw Truth, your thing about the emotional side of it being quite important, I agree with. I just think that that's such a long and difficult topic. It might take us a while to figure out how to approach it, but that's definitely the truth. There's a lot more to this complicated thing called life than just some certain supplement that we haven't quite had enough of.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There's a Japanese fellow named Emoto who's done a lot of work with water, and are you familiar with him?
Yes, quite. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
that's very interesting because that's the water crystal with, let's say, again, heavy metal, death metal, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just a bad environment. You don't want to be in that environment. I mean, why would if you go to like a train station or something, a really, really noisy place, or like an airport, can you imagine living there? Right, with all that noise? And it's not a good work environment either. But so yeah, sure, Emoto is worth everybody looking into. It's a very important topic, and you can imagine that water is going to be much better for one's health or for plants or such.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we can wrap it up now. I think the final thing I would say is I started this saying I've kind of been waiting a long time for certain elitist criminal types to shuffle off this mortal coil, right? And I just keep waiting and waiting. And I guess, Herm, to find the technical answer, did you see the movie Eyes Wide Shut? The Tom Cruise is a doctor, and that higher level guy who has the party that he goes to.
Unfortunately, I missed that movie.
Oh, you missed that.
Right,
okay.
so.
Well, I think I guess what I'm trying to say is the doctor for David Rockefeller, right? I would kind of like to see his lab and his office. Is what I'm saying.
Oh yeah.
I think that might be where we could really make some progress on life extension. But barring that, I think we need to work on staying healthy and happy so that we can outlive these guys.
Yeah.
Well,
that's kind of
the way I was figuring it. Sorry, the way I was figuring it too was that if you look at sort of natural life expectancy, right, it's like about 35 and give or take on average, whatever that means. But I mean, pretty much, every year after 35 is sort of a great gift from the, great spirit as far as I'm concerned. But the warranty's now out, they're just evolutionarily, the evolutionary warranty, like we'll get you to 35 so you can have a few kids. Once that's over, you're basically, if you're a man, you're pretty expendable. I mean, the women probably have a little bit more wisdom, so they tend to live a little longer, it shows the great wisdom. But, other than that, I mean, every year, a lot of this life extension I see too is addressing what happens after that period of time, which may have actually been a really good thing. For example, clotting your blood is really great when you're 12 years old and get hit by a tiger, but if at 50 you get a stroke, that kind of stuff. So
yeah, sure, that's part of the whole mystery of it, and that's why it's hard to give absolutes here.
And you'll have students 10 or 20 years from now that might want to hear from you. Well, you probably want to make an effort to live that long, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, any final thoughts past that? Okay, well, let's wrap it up. We've gone on a long time, and so that'll do it for this week. And next week, I think we're going to talk about what is the opposite of dumbing down. So thank you, Herb and Raw Truth.
Oh, you are.
Thank you, Plain. Thank you, Raw Truth.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Okay, bye.
Enjoy it, guys.